Hi everyone, my name is Julie Sebi. I'm the owner and author of the Analytics Corner blog, found at the URL on the screen. Welcome to video number 3 in my Power Automate for Beginners series. The first video explained how to navigate Power Automate menus. The second covered triggers and actions. And this video provides useful information for your first builds based on what I struggled with when first learning Power Automate. All of these videos are available on my YouTube channel, so please subscribe. The first thing that we're going to talk about in this video is the fact that Power Automate is a cloud-based application, which is distinctly different from working in desktop applications because you're interacting with a web page. In many desktop applications, users will access menus by right-clicking. But when interacting with web pages, right-clicking doesn't really produce anything useful. This is just a menu for interacting with the internet, not the application. So no right-clicking in Power Automate, left-clicking only. Now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about the key to configuring actions when building and developing in Power Automate. And that key is something called dynamic content. So what is dynamic content and when do you use it? In simple terms, dynamic content is data produced from a trigger or an action that can be used in subsequent actions. Both triggers and actions can produce dynamic content. Triggers and action can use dynamic content. Environmental variables are a form of dynamic content used in triggers without the content being created by the flow itself. And finally, dynamic content can be used anywhere in the flow after creation. Don't worry too much about environmental variables now. The reason I mention them is simply to point out that it is possible for both triggers and actions to produce and use dynamic content. So, how do you find dynamic content? Users access dynamic content from a blue Add Dynamic Content link. And sometimes the link doesn't appear until you click in the action first. And then both the dynamic content link and the menu will pop up. Unfortunately, you can't move this menu. It's going to be anchored to roughly this point on your action. You can only scroll up or down in order to see more of the menu. Dynamic content appears under a header equal to the name of the action that generated it. As your flow grows in the number of actions, so will the list of dynamic content. And so when that happens, you want to make sure to use this type to search functionality, and this will work off of the header or off of the content itself. And just so I'm clear, I'll scroll back up and you can see that my first trigger is named when a new channel message is added, and then that corresponds to this header, and this is all of the different dynamic content created by that trigger. Okay, so what can you do with dynamic content? We're going to use this flow as an example. And in this flow, I use a Microsoft Teams trigger to kick off an Outlook action. So when someone posts into the RPA development team, into the general channel, Outlook will send me an email. The body of the email is configured with dynamic content. That's what this is right here. The specific piece of dynamic content is the message body from the Teams message. So in other words, Power Automate will look at my Teams message and put that message in the body of the email that it sends. Hence the term dynamic content. Hence the term dynamic content. The message body will be different depending on Teams message. So let's run this flow and see it in action. I'm going to click the test button and I'm going to select manually, which means that I will need to manually go into my Teams channel and post a message in order to trigger the flow. So I'll click test. It gives me a little message that says I need to go do that. I'll pull up my Teams and I will say creating content, ignore this message. I'll hit send, and then we'll go to my email. I hit send receive, and here is the Power Automate generated email, and you can see that this matches the content of my Teams message, and that's pretty cool. So let's go back to my flow, and I just want to briefly show you the options that are available for this particular trigger so you get a sense and a flavor for what can be done. So I'll click in this action, and you'll see here that we could use the message body, which is what I'm doing right now. There's a few other user ID and the message ID could possibly be very important, as could the message importance or where it was sent from, and if it was modified. So dynamic content is the building blocks of Power Automate actions. Each trigger and action come with its own collection of dynamic content, and once you become familiar with the concept, you'll look to build flows around available dynamic content. It will make building in Power Automate a breeze. So next, let's talk about naming actions and triggers, as this is an important consideration when you're building flows. So I've written before about just how difficult naming things is, and Power Automate is no exception. When naming actions, there are several important considerations. But first, how or where do we rename an action or a trigger? And the answer is we use this menu with the 3 dots, and you'll see that there is an option here to rename. And when I click on that, it lights up the name of the action and I can edit or modify this. So that's how you rename an action. When I first started working in Power Automate, I used the action name to take notes and track my work. Over time, I found out that this was not really a good practice. The name you give the action or trigger appears as dynamic content. We know that. I covered that just a few minutes ago. Thus, it's not really a good idea to duplicate names or to create names. Otherwise, it's very easy once you get a long list of dynamic content to mistake one piece of content for another. Another thing to take into consideration is that by default, whenever you add a new action, the action name essentially equals the action. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to add a SharePoint action here. We're not really going to do anything with this. It's just to illustrate. I'm looking for an action called create item. And so in Power Automate, the name of the action is going to essentially default to the action. So if I click on this, it defaults to create item. When I first started in Power Automate, I often followed someone else's flow, trying to mimic their actions. But what happens is that often a developer will completely rename an action based on what it's doing. So in this case, I could say update name, which has, could be related to what the action is doing, but if you're new in Power Automate, then you don't know what this action is. And so when developers would rename actions, I had no idea which action they were using. So that's just a consideration if you're collaborating with others. One option when you're naming things is to leave the name of the action and follow it with a few words that differentiate the action or the trigger, which is essentially what I did here at the top. That way it's easy for people to understand the work. Since my early Power Automate days, I have learned that you can find the name of the action by clicking on the question mark, which will pull up the help. And as you can see, this will very easily tell you that this is the create item SharePoint action. So my original problem of not knowing what the action was can easily be solved. I'd like to give you a third consideration, and to do that, we're going to go into a different Power Automate flow. You don't need to know a lot about what this flow is doing. I'm only going to draw your attention to 2 compose tools that I'm using to write expressions. So even though I haven't covered expressions yet, know that when you write expressions, the name of the action appears in the expression. So I'm going to hover over this expression so you can see it in its entirety. And you'll notice that I am using the action above change to date, which is get date from subject. And you can see that get date from subject is used and written in that expression. Because of this, it's better not to put spaces in the action name and to apply a consistent case convention, even though, as you can see, I wasn't consistent from one compose to the next. I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And you can imagine that if I had put a bunch of spaces or made this really lengthy and long, that this expression would get kind of hard to see, hard to interpret. Furthermore, if you put spaces in the name of an expression, then they need to be replaced when underscores when writing expressions. So for example, I'll go ahead and modify this get date from subject. And so if I change this in this way, in order to make this expression work, I would need to go in and add underscores to my expression. spaces won't be interpreted correctly. So I can't do this. I can't do spaces. I have to do underscores. So this is something just to keep in mind, A, as you are naming your actions, and then B, as you start working with expressions. It's also probably worth noting that if you're building up your expression using the dynamic content menu, then Power Automate will do this for you. So I'm just going to locate get date from subject in my dynamic content menu. Here it is, and I'll click that, and you'll see that when I use the menu, it puts in the underscores for me. But if I'm typing out an expression, I have to know that spaces are a no-go. So just to summarize what I want you to know about naming actions and triggers, be aware of the following. Names should differentiate the action so that you don't confuse dynamic content. Long names make writing expressions harder. Spaces in a name aren't valid syntax when writing expressions. Instead, underscores must be used in place of spaces. And finally, it's a good idea to decide on a case syntax and stick to it. So now that you understand the impact of naming actions, let's talk about better ways to annotate the flows than in the name, because Power Automate provides some really good tools for this. So I'm going to hop back over to my original flow, and you have 3 options for providing information about your flow. They're all 3 located in the 3-dot menu. So we have the rename option. There are also options for comments and for notes. So let me show you the difference. So I'll actually put a note in the send email rather than in the trigger. And you'll see that a note is added below the action name. And I prefer this way of annotating my workflows rather than changing the name because of the reasons that we just discussed. And so that's super helpful for just keeping track of how a flow is built. But there is another functionality called commenting that is useful for collaborating. Comments pop up in a pane on the right-hand side of the screen, and I can add comments about the workflow, such as needs more dynamic content in the body, but in addition to the message itself, I can also tag people. So if I tag Chris in this comment, it will send him an email and he will be notified that I have tagged him in this flow. The other cool thing about comments is that once you have created them, they can be resolved. And now that it's posted, Chris can come in, he can see my comment, and maybe he'll update my flow, and then we will resolve this thread and it goes away. Or it shows up as resolved and then can be completely deleted from the flow. So this is a really great functionality for collaboration. The only thing I want to note is that if you're moving flows through environments, such as moving from QA to UAT to prod, comments don't migrate from one environment to the next. Comments in QA won't appear in UAT. And so now you know a little bit more about building and developing in Power Automate. But before I wrap up, I want to talk about one other trap that I fell into when I started with Power Automate. And so for that, I'm going to go back to my other flow. So I'm going to go back to this other flow where I have compose tools and a few other actions. And you'll notice that with a lot of, or all of the Power Automate actions, there are text input boxes, or what seems like text input boxes. But really, you're meant to use the dynamic content menus and then the expression menus that pop up when you click in this box. If you start typing out an expression here, this isn't really going to work. So you have to use the dynamic content dialog and the expression dialog. You also have to click OK, or in this case, update. I'll show you what I mean. If I click on this and I modify this expression, you have to click update. You can't just click out. If you click out, you're going to lose your changes. And so those are places where I got hung up in Power Automate. I kept trying to type in these boxes. I kept trying to update and then just click out of it. And neither of those things will work very well for you. And finally, when I first started working in Power Automate, I found that my mousing actions were inefficient and pretty clunky. But over time, as I essentially, as I watched more YouTube videos of other folks who had been doing it longer, I got better at it. And so the mousing actions and the where to click may be frustrating at first, but just be patient. You'll become much more proficient as you start working. In my next video, I'll assume that you have started building some flows, but maybe they're not quite working just right, and we'll talk about how to troubleshoot flows. Thanks, and have a great day.